829th contact. Sunday, December 25, 2022, 9:14 HRS. Billy. Salome, ta, my friend. There you are again, but be welcome to my modest den. Today I have some things that we have never talked about. For a question has been put to me, and for once I want to ask you to answer it, for your answer will certainly carry more weight than if I explain what really is. While I know the answer to the question, I have never bothered to ask on my own if you might be able to talk about it sometime. Of course, I know that no questions will be answered by you if they are not in my own interest, but surely the world will not end if we make an exception. Ta. Then let's hear what you have to ask. But greetings also, Edouard, my friend. And thank you for your welcome. Billy. Thank you. The question was raised as to how it is with you, whether you also have homosexual men and lesbian women, bisexual, sadistically or masochistically oriented people, etc. in your peoples? If so, this is the second question: what do you call them in terms of gender? E.g., we just call these human beings here on Earth man and just woman. Ta. Meaningfully we call them gender-wise, no different than Earth humans do, male and female. In our language, we call the man as shor, and the woman as kager. Moreover, it is to be explained that it corresponds absolutely to the conditions of nature that with regard to the sexes of the human beings different forms appear. This results both in the actual human being, as we are, as well as in other human beings, such as giant or small human beings, as well as in human beings who have a completely different appearance than purely human beings, i.e., who are also physically different from us. Billy. Do you mean, for example, the appearance of Asina, because she is, I suppose, an actual human being, but she has a body and a head that are, if I may say so, reptilian? Ta. That is indeed the case. Billy. Good, but it is also the case with you and with human beings like Asina that everything is oriented in the same way with regard to sex-sexual acts. Ta. Of course, you are saying something that you can actually answer yourself to your satisfaction. But I want to explain the answer, namely that everywhere in all universes all differences of the sexual occur in its application. Consequently normal sexuality resp alloiophilia resp heterosexuality is to be understood as bisexual between woman and man, if I may say so. Alongside this, homosexuality also appears, where this is oriented from man to man, while lesbianism applies to woman with woman. In addition, there is the fact that homosexuality proper and lesbianism proper, outside the strictness of the latter, also have two gendered forms of homosexuality and lesbianism. In this form, men as homosexuals also have sexual relations with women, as well as lesbians with men, but these sexual forms are neither abnormal nor repugnant. On the contrary, however, this is often the case on Earth, mainly for confused and usually religiously believing reasons and misunderstandings. As I know, it is considered deviant and even punishable by fine and death penalty. Normality is also to be conceded in a completely natural framework, whereby the bisexual activity rests the heterosexuality of every human being who is predisposed in this respect is directed towards this alone. However, sexual sadism and sexual masochism are to be mentioned, which as pathological phenomena are natural in this form, but nevertheless correspond to a degeneration. This, however, is absolutely incomprehensible to the Earth human and testifies to how he has fallen prey to faith and ignorant stupidity, because he is not able to ascertain it according to reality. Consequently, he is unable to understand that everything is degenerate and at the same time naturally given and normal with regard to the effectiveness in this respect. But it will be your task to explain this, because you certainly know how to explain it better. With regard to your question, however, I have to explain that all the forms of sexuality mentioned, because they are natural and normal throughout, are also given with us, as this is given in all spheres of all livingness in the entire sphere of creation. Therefore, we cannot and must not speak of abnormality in what is purely normal, as Earth humans understand and incorrectly represent it. What is natural is based on the given nature of creation and is therefore a law of the natural. And this is not only the case with the human being, but with all genera and species of all living beings, that is, with animals, creatures, and all other life forms. Exceptions to this, however, are pedophilia, bestiality, sadism and masochism. These degenerations, which, however, are to be called normal as a disease, are based on an addiction which the human beings acquire uncontrollably through fantasies and confusing imagination up to the point of mental morbidity and let them degenerate in an illusory way. The whole, however, is an effective fact, which is just as well known to you, consequently you know and understand everything in these matters as well as I do, consequently you could explain everything just as well as I do, perhaps even better. That is why I think that you understand it much better to explain this to the Earth humans, because you have to deal with them every day and have also created a flair for speaking to them correctly and also for using the correct words. However, I still want to explain that sexual sadism and masochism, as well as sadomasochism and bestiality, require a special explanation, for as I know, the Earth humans misunderstand these factors in a confused way, consequently an explanation in this regard is inevitable, which, however, you can answer yourself. Billy. Actually, I had the thought that you would answer everything. Ta. That would really be beyond what corresponds to my interest, for I cannot and will not spend myself in such earth-human matters, which is why it is probably up to your wanting or not wanting. Billy. I understand, then I will do it. Good, because with animals, creatures, and all other life forms it is much rarer than with human beings that sexual manifestations arise that fall outside the usual. Nevertheless, the same thing exists everywhere, not only on Earth, but universally in all areas of the 7 universes of creation rest in their matter belts and thus on planetary formations on which any kind of life exists. This is also related to rape and affective degenerations in relation to sexual acts, even if this is only very rarely or never observed by human beings in other life forms. But the fact that it is actually the case that the sexual practices mentioned exist in all living beings is a reality, and it is important that the human being knows this. This also results in mixtures, which the human being consciously uses to produce new species etc., whereby new species and varieties etc. are created, but which also result in new life forms in nature, even if this contradicts every biology theory etc. and is disputed by experts. This, of course, results just as consciously willed by the human being, who in no way sets himself any limits when he wants to achieve something in any form. What results in further forms, however, with regard to sadism and masochism or even sadomasochism and sodomy, is generally the following, which, however, does not correspond to a personality disorder, as experts falsely claim, but to a disorder of consciousness, because the personality can never be affected by any influences of a personal or foreign kind. And it is also to be said that when I speak of the limits which the earthling does not set for himself and thereby destroys much, then it is also to be said that nature is biologically founded differently from what so-called science claims, for out of it new genera and species arise, which, inexplicably for the wise scientists, result in nature, like certain diverse assemblages from which new life results. For this changes in such a way as the planet itself, which on the one hand is much older than 4.5 million years, which science assumes because it can only determine the age of those things it finds in the Earth's crust, but not what constitutes the actual inner life of the planet itself. This is billions of years earlier than the Earth's crust, in which only millions of years old things are stored, but nothing of the origin, which goes back to several billion years earlier than is claimed. Furthermore, the Earth's crust changes in the course of time in such a way that the Earth's surface also changes, so that, for example, one day there will be sea where there is land or mountains today, as for example in the USA, where Death Valley is lowering and dividing in such a way that in the future America will be separated by an intermediate sea into a northern and southern part. But that is completely natural, because the planet is alive and constantly changing, and what is currently happening in the USA with the cold wave is only a foretaste of what will happen worldwide in the future due to climate change, namely that large parts of the Earth will be hit alternately by cold waves and heat waves, including the countries in the south, and it will become the case that the waters of the sea will rise again and swallow up much land. This, however, will happen worldwide, and not only due to nature, but to a very high percentage triggered by overpopulation, which would have to be minimized, which is humanly possible only by stopping births for several years. This, if one day the already threatening madness does not happen, that the earthly overpopulation of mankind is decimated very far-reaching by an evil act of violence. But this already existing threat to decimate the overpopulation can really still be countered by a controlled and sensible birth stop of several years, for the earthling has long since invented and worked out the means that can be used, namely by using good means of contraception, such as condoms, by carrying out any kind of artificial infertility, by carrying out an operative contraception, by carrying out a sterilization resp and intersection resp and emasculation, or also by applying other practices. But I know that this will meet with just as much rejection as leaving the ecosystems alone, which have already been largely destroyed, as well as the majority of all natural life forms known to human beings, starting with animals and all other living beings down to the last blade of grass. But already the diverse life, effectively numbering in the millions, of all living beings still unknown to human beings, including human beings, is being endangered and destroyed along with their habitat. So now the ecosystem of the oceans is also to be destroyed so that the human beings can exterminate the as yet unknown life on the seabed, where in million-fold variety life crawls, moves, or swims. So far, human beings know nothing about it how million-fold the life on and in the bottom of the sea is, but nevertheless everything is to be destroyed and exploited, because the Earth's resources will soon have been finally exploited, such as gold, chrome and rare earths and other resources, etc. No thought is given to the fact that all life, including that of the human being, will be destroyed and exterminated, because only the financial profit that can be gained through the destruction is thought of, as well as of the killing of human beings, e.g. through the death penalty, war and in such a wise, as America is planning, that Putin is to be insidiously disingenuously assassinated by Secret Service, as you said recently. But I actually still had something else to bring up, which I still remember from SPAF, that soon the enthusiasm of the e-car delusion will die down as fast as it was ramped up by the governments and made a furor mainly in Europe. But there is something else to be said, namely that America is to be mentioned, which is the actual warmonger and is guilty for the fact that the war is going on in Ukraine, which is led by the other warmonger, according to Zelensky. Various misguided politicians believe that supplying weapons to Ukraine to Zelensky is the fastest way to peace. This clearly proves that these leaders are completely misguided. Weapons and their use never bring peace, but only death, destruction and subjugation, which means a continuation of strife and brings hatred and revenge. If it were not for America and Zelensky and all the arms suppliers, the war would end quickly. Billy. That is probably so, but I don't want to talk about that, but that, namely, already about 70 and also already 280 million years ago, as well as 20,000 or 10,000 years ago, many living beings were naturally exterminated or driven away to other parts of the world and simply migrated, e.g. from the continent that is now America, from which animals and creatures etc. spread as far as Asia and Arabia or Africa. But with natural decimation it is not enough, for now the earthling does it completely irresponsibly likewise of his own accord, and that erroneously wholly for the dubious good of overpopulation, as well as for the sake of luxury and wealth. Back then, when the dinosaurs existed, it was largely natural events that led to the disappearance of the great living creatures. At that time, by the way, even if it is vehemently denied by the great scientists and mad know-it-alls and insulted as wild fantasy, there were also human beings who, however, were not born here on Earth, but who actually existed, as I once saw on a journey back into the past with SPAF. It is true that the natural decimation did not happen completely with all life forms at that time, consequently individual groups could be preserved, whose descendants were still born until a few millennia ago, but then gradually died out, except for very few specimens, although there was still a I read of this in Father's annals, and I investigated for myself where you had been. It was the wildland area where what is now America was formed, and it was the place Glen R. Billy. Aha, so you are researching what all went on in your father's day. Yes. Through that I also found there a fossilized excrement of a human being, which on Earth is called coprolite. When I examined it closely, I was astonished to find that the excrement was 74 million years old. Together you have traveled very far back in time, much further than only 25 million years ago. Billy. Yes, that was very interesting for me, because I learned a lot of things that happened at very early times, when Earth had not yet been created by evolution. And it is to be said that in those early times many things, indeed many things, were quite different from what the all-knowing of today claim, precisely those who concern themselves with the past. It may now be said what I was instructed by SPAF not to speak openly about until you yourself would raise the subject of non-earthly beings. And that is exactly what you have done now, by talking about the human excrement that you found and then analyzing its age. So, I think I may now speak openly and say that beings from the depths of the space of this universe visited the Earth before there were Earthlings. Since then, however, their descendants have come here again and again, creating many things for the human beings of Earth in the last 390,000 years or so, which were often only achieved with hovering techniques. Especially what concerned the moving, setting up and stacking of building elements weighing tons, such as 10, 20, 30, 50 tons or even heavier elements, was done by technology that made it possible to levitate the materials. In very few cases, something was also moved telekinetically, but this was a real rarity. The processing of the heavy elements was usually done by machine, if one may say so to what was just used. The machining was done in such a way that the elements were so accurate to the hundredth or even thousandth of a millimeter that everything fitted together in such a way that practically not even a hair could be pushed in between. This is precisely something that the clever earthlings of today, who deal with these things of the past in big words and knowing, cannot understand how everything really came about in this respect. Their wild fantasies of how it was and how it all came about are really hilariously stupid. Well, when the earthlings at a much later time, as a result of traditions etc., worked, hewed and chiseled stones, that was primitive again. But the fact is that the earthlings at that time did not have heavy machinery with which they could have done everything, and above all not with human power, as many archaeologists etc. imaginatively spout about and think up the most impossible constructions with which the human beings of earlier civilizations are supposed to have made the impossible possible and managed it. Whether the people who traveled far and wide were always persons of the same people, and also whether it was later their descendants who came here and who, I do not know. But it is to be assumed that the various groups were somehow connected. What is clear to me, however, is that some of the long-distance travelers rose up as gods who were then worshipped by the earthlings and to whom human sacrifices were also made. Some of them were real giants of different sizes, but there were also human beings of normal sizes, and then also dwarfs of normal size, so they were not microsomic human beings. And there were also long-skulled and tall-skulled people, which the earthlings then imitated by integrating the skulls of infants. Svath explained that most of these long-distance travelers had intermingled with the earthlings all over the world, so that it would also be the case in the distant future that tall stature, long skulls and high skulls would be preserved and that earthlings of this kind would be born again and again, if they could be traced back to the lines of the interminglings of that time. Also, with guidance and assistance, entire cities were built all over the earth, some of which, however, sank in the seas or in large lakes in later times due to natural phenomena, were overgrown by primeval forests or others were covered by sand drifts. This can be understood, for example, when one knows that every year about 50,000 tons of sand are blown from Africa, mainly from the Sahara and other African desert areas, by the wind across the Atlantic Ocean to South America. Thus, human beings can perhaps imagine that such cities existed 7,000, 10,000 or even more years ago in the past and were buried under vast amounts of sand and may sooner or later be found by archaeologists etc. Unfortunately, such beings from the vastness of the matter belt also brought various bacteria and viruses to Earth, which since then have been spreading worldwide from time to time and even causing health havoc. But this does not mean that Figa must henceforth concern itself with prehistory, and I personally also do not feel called to devote myself to this field. Besides, this is also not important and has nothing to do with the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, which I have to teach to the human beings of the earth, at least to those who are willing to think, learn and live according to their own will and decision on the basis of reality and its truth. And the very distant descendants who are still, as usual in the heat of the moment I completely strayed from what I had actually begun to talk about and explain. However, I want to continue with this now, but I also want to mention that what I have said is the case with everything, because the scientists simply assume something, which they then make into an opinion, which is finally presented as a fixed fact and asserted that it was or is like this and not otherwise. So it is also with the creation of false theories and assumptions concerning the earth, especially concerning its earlier and often changed appearance over millions of years. The changes that have taken place over the last 20,000 to 30,000 years and that have altered the land masses, the mountains and deserts, as well as the oceans and the entire planet and all life, can only be pieced together by these wise men of science. They do this through findings in the earth, in ice, water and rock, etc., by which the researchers then mean themselves greatly. But the fact that they have helped in every way to destroy the entire ecosystem of the planet and continue to do so is never taken into consideration. For a long time now, the earthlings have also been destroying the entire ecosystems of the oceans, because it is still not understood that they have not only wiped out the earth on the planet's surface and a great deal of natural life on it, but that they will now also destroy the bottom of the oceans and all life down there. For quite some time now, almost a century now, as far as I know, they have been rooting around at the bottom of the seas, disturbing and destroying everything. Now, as far as I know, it is mainly about manganese nodules that are to be mined robbed from the seabed. Over thousands of years, manganese nodules form around some kind of core, and the manganese then deposits various metals from the water and holds them within itself, and so on. These nodules are to be industrially extracted from the seabed and processed in such a way that the already very scarce and increasingly expensive metals etc. can be extracted from them. As Svath already explained to me in the 1940s, the processing of the tubers etc. will involve the death of many human lives, because the extraction of the expensive raw materials from the manganese will bring great and dangerous problems. But enough of that now, because I am supposed to talk about what I asked you, because as you said, I am supposed to do it, just the explaining regarding sadism, etc., because you don't want to talk about it or something. Sadism is a pathological state of consciousness, which as an actual factor is directed towards painful psychological and physical torture of a fellow human being, animal or any other life form, whereby in every case a victim is always the one who suffers. In particular, sadism in sex is a sensation that gives sexual pleasure to the sadistic human being, male or female, through a torture of pain of the female or male sexual partner. Sadism is basically a pathological disorder of consciousness, but not a personality disorder, as experts claim, whereby the human being violates the physical or psychological integrity of another human being or another life form of any species or kind by inflicting pain on it. If sadism is pronounced in human beings, they experience a high level of sensual pleasure through it, which they act out during sex, for example, where inflicting pain on their sex partner gives them a high level of pleasure. However, sadism in humans does not necessarily have to be the self-inflicted torture of a victim, but humans also find sadistic satisfaction and pleasure, etc., by observing some kind of agonizing suffering in other human beings or in animals, creatures, or other life forms, and thus somehow experience and also feel the suffering or pain in this way. Sadism is a pathological emergence resp, a disorder of consciousness, which begins and develops in the early years of human beings, whereby on the one hand external education and self-education, as well as contact and the environment etc., play a decisive role. This is equally the case with every developing degeneration, which is based on the fact that it develops into an addictive disease, as is also caused by drugs of all kinds, for example, which cannot be controlled and therefore cannot be mastered. Sadism evokes a feeling of pleasure and joy etc. in human beings when they can inflict psychological as well as massive physical pain on another human being, animal, or other living being or simply observe it. Although this is an absolute naturality, it nevertheless corresponds to an unnaturalness and degeneracy, namely as a result of an erroneous and confused fantasy and a disease arising from it, which is therefore to be judged and understood as natural from the point of view of the emergence, because the emergence of a disease corresponds to a natural process of development. This comes about in degenerations because a disease, also a disease of consciousness, as well as abnormal thinking etc., comes about through faulty external education or self-education as well as through other influences and environments etc., thus as a natural process of the functional of the brain. In any case, then, sadism in its way is given in both forms, both as a sham thought work and as a disease which, as a form of naturalness, arises from a wrong upbringing, the thought processes, the imagination and from a deviant behavior. The disease arises absolutely clearly as the result of the effect of thought, whereby this then, based on the law of naturalness, always remains present. The human being is fundamentally arranged in this natural form, that consequently a degeneracy arises from wrong thoughts and behavior, from which a disease develops, which is then both psychic and behavioral, but which in origin comes about through some kind of wrong education and self-education, and through this, the human being falls prey to a disease of degeneracy, which arises and is triggered as a result of the degenerate thoughts. This therefore results logically only as a result of erroneous and confused illusory thoughts. These are, after all, only apparently healthy and correct, but in every respect false, delusional and pathological, consequently they appear in every individual case as a natural reaction as a degenerative disease. This, then, is to be understood as naturality. Consequently, such a disease results from degenerated thoughts and behavior, which can also show other very diverse forms, such as hatred, envy, jealousy, murderousness, delusion, every form of vice, megalomania, selfishness, deceitfulness, meanness, asociality in every form, imperiousness, violence, addiction to power, belligerence or enmity, etc. All these types express themselves as degenerations which cannot be controlled and therefore cannot be controlled. Masochism, like sadism, is a pathological disorder of the consciousness of human beings who long for submissiveness and demand subordination, humiliation and defeat. However, this is not only peculiar to the masochist in private life and social life, but also in sexual acts. In private life, masochism is often partly expressed in professional life, e.g. when failures occur or are deliberately brought about in the form of self-mortification in order to bring about one's own voluntary deprivations and sufferings, which thereby promote one's own masochistic feelings of pleasure in submissiveness and subordination. Masochism is thus in human beings a disorder of consciousness in which they practically derive positive emotions from it in the way that pain is inflicted on them and they are humiliated by it. However, if masochism is very pronounced, it often leads to suicide in the course of one's life, or it results in a potential danger to one's life, which can be realized in some way. Sadomasochism is, of course, also a disorder of consciousness, which develops in the same way as sadism and masochism, but which together form a connection and are also present in a person. The infliction of pain on the sexual partner, as well as the self-suffering of pain by the sexual partner, leads to sexual arousal and pleasure, which is a variant of the sadomasochistic sexual experience. With the full sexual satisfaction through the suffering of humiliation, agony, and pain, sadomasochism is fulfilled on the whole. Sodomy/zoophilia is equally a disorder of consciousness that arises in the same way as any other form of self-provoked degeneracy. Engaging in sexual activity with animals, e.g. dogs, sheep or goats or other animals, is not as rare as human beings may think, but it is simply not noticed because the human being is in and of itself very inattentive. There are different forms of sodomy, which are practiced by women, but also by men. Sodomy is based on a disorder of consciousness, namely on the so-called sexual preference rest perversion. In the case of sexual acts, or if I want to say sexual intercourse, with animals, these are more widespread than human beings, if at all, imagine. And if it is to be said how the practices of sodomy are carried out with animals, then it certainly does not need to be explained either in relation to sodomy-oriented women or men. If the history of sodomy is traced, it already goes back to the beginnings of earthly humanity, as women and men were already using the practice of sexual acts with animals, which effectively was not only commonplace, but often ended in murder and manslaughter when an animal was unauthorizedly used by someone other than the owner himself. In the time when civilizations and religions came, the sexual practices of sodomy were no longer practiced in such a way that fellow human beings could witness the goings-on, as it was in early times, because suddenly everything was considered abnormal, whereby sodomy was even used by Christianity to blaspheme all sexual practices of human beings as sodomy, which did not exclusively serve to produce offspring. Criminal prosecution and execution of human beings was even ordered, especially in the Middle Ages and early modern times, if it became known that a human being practiced sodomy. Thus, women who allowed themselves to be sexually satisfied by their dogs, sheep or goats and men who engaged in anal intercourse with all kinds of animals were summarily executed, although this was very rarely recorded and handed down in court records. In the Middle Ages, the concept of sodomy was established, whereby unnatural sexual practices were listed, such as mainly the form of sexual satisfaction with dogs, but also the anal intercourse of men with animals of various species and types. So also homosexuality of men and lesbianism of women were cursed as sodomy and punished with death, and called the silent sin, or the sin without a name, as well as that terrible sin which must not be called among Christians, and so on. The most common insult, however, was vice against nature. The word sodomy was changed after the word Sodom, as it applies in the Book of Lies in the Bible, Book of Lies according to the alleged Jesus Christ, with regard to the city of Sodom, whose inhabitants are said to have formed the Sodom of sin, so to speak, which was in reality destroyed by a meteorite, from which the story was then made that God had destroyed it by fire and brimstone. With this I have actually said and explained everything that I consider necessary. But what I do want to say, which is unfortunately often misunderstood, is the word simple, which I often use and which actually has the sense of natural for me when I explain something. So something is simple or just natural. Ta. I know that. But the good thing is that you have explained everything better than if I had. How it is convenient for you, I am afraid it is not for me. Billy. You shouldn't hide your light under a bushel. But it is incomprehensible to me that this subject is not taught in schools, since it is something that actually belongs to general knowledge. But enough of that, perhaps we should say a few things about the foreigners, because it is probably correct for me to call up this conversation and write it down so that it is accessible to all who are interested. When I think that all the UFOs that are being sighted around the world, as well as the foreign be. Ta. But what you are saying, that's supposed to. Billy. I know that and I will just dot it too. Ta. Good. We are absolutely careful, as all our ancestors were, and have been since they came into this universe, that we cannot be observed or located under any circumstances. Consequently we have not allowed ourselves to be seen or photographed by FIGA members for a long time now, as we used to do. It has become too dangerous for us in this respect. Our presence has to remain unrecognizable, because our directives have recently been updated, because certain foresights concerning the future of earthly humanity and the foreigners are very unpleasant and require a stricter observance of our instructions concerning our activity on Earth. The extension of our directives henceforth prohibit any possibility of observation or contact by technical tracking of our flying apparatus, nor by any sighting by Earth humans. And the present, whom we call the foreigners, because. Billy. Excuse me, but I think you just meant to say that, shall not be named, what is really behind them. Ta. You say it, consequently, I don't have to elaborate on what I actually wanted to say. Billy. What has been said is also enough, but that you are making an effort of observation concerning the foreigners, that is allowed to be said, isn't it? Ta. Yes, it doesn't necessarily have to be kept quiet, especially since you are now. Billy. Let the cat out of the bag. Ta. Yeah, something like that. For us, it is important that we investigate the activities of the foreigners very carefully, inside and out. Apart from the knowledge gained from this, we also know that we have to keep to what we have always maintained, namely that we remain unrecognized, both in relation to the Earth humans and in relation to the foreigners, whose technology is very far behind ours, but whom they would inevitably want to get hold of if they could come into contact with us. We know very well their aspirations and are able to anticipate what would result from contact with them. In addition, we are fully aware that all observations of Earth humans regarding the flying objects of foreigners by the military, pilots and private individuals are consistently denied, concealed, commented on with flimsy lies or judged to be ridiculous by the offices responsible for them. This is despite the fact that the observations are real and correspond to reality, as some of these sightings can also be documented on film or photographically. There are also scientists, etc., who are involved in ridiculing such effective sightings or falsely explaining them as natural phenomena, which in reality are not. And this happens in all states of the earth, also in your home country, Switzerland, because... Billy. You are not telling me anything new, because I am not the only one who knows this, because all of us in the center, as well as FIGUNs from outside, as well as certain witnesses from Schmadrudi, can tell you a thing or two about it. The fact that the center and its surroundings are being monitored is already known around the world, and that they are even spying around here with drones and photographing everything from above, and even by people from foreign countries, we also know that. Ta. Not only is there a curious interest, but fear is also often the reason, namely. For this reason, in turn, a culture of fear of extraterrestrials was also deliberately created from above, which has spread in the state leaderships. That is why everything is concealed by the responsible agencies and state leaders, etc., especially by those in the USA secret government, who... Billy. I am also aware of that, Anne. Ta. But what you are not supposed to call openly, as well as some other statements not, like... Billy. That's just where I am going to put my dots again. But enough is enough of what we have been talking about, we really don't need to go on with that. On the contrary, I have something that seems more important to me and that I want to bring up. If you want to listen, if I read it out briefly? Ta. Of course. Billy. This letter here, read it please. Ta. I can only explain that we Plagiaran really have no interest whatsoever in interfering in any earthly matters, neither in political nor in private affairs. Nor do we influence any Earth humans, nor do we make any attacks on Earth humans, nor on military or technical matters. Billy. I know that, just as I know that there is no karma, but that this is absolute nonsense and a religious assertion that is not true, because there is no rebirth that would bring such things with it, because a completely new personality is born that has no relevance to the last previous one before the human being just died. But now please listen to what I have written for the human beings of the earth. Remain independent at all times, and be self-aware, think for yourself, independently, and do not let others think for you, if you are never a believer and ever will be. Trust only yourself, and also only if you think correctly and are able to make correct decisions, which will bring you success, but never disadvantage. Never rely on what other people say, but consider and check everything for its reality and truth, and only then, when you have recognized the correctness of what you have been told or advised as truth, use what you have been told or advised for your benefit, as well as for your knowledge and advantage. Do not look at what other people are and do, but always strive to think for yourself and to decide and do what is best in order to recognize what is correct. Whatever you do, do it with humility, decency, honor and dignity, as well as with understanding and reason. Be always alone for yourself in thought, decision and action, and never indulge in arrogance, megalomania and haughtiness, as well as dishonesty, arrogance, recklessness, conceit, lying, heedlessness, vulnerability and deceit, etc. Never believe in a higher power above you, not in an imaginary god, gods, or any other power, because you yourself are the power, energy, and strength above yourself, therefore it is you yourself who leads and manages your own life. Know about yourself, about your own energy and power, know about your abilities and skills, and use everything at all times in a correct and inviolable way. Believe not in human beings, but know reality and its truth, and use it alone to do right, to lead your life, and also to act with honor and dignity. Know for yourself the formation of your life, existence, and well-being, and know only your actions in reality and truth, and recognize for yourself the reality and its power, as well as the knowledge of the truth of life, far from any belief in a God or human beings. Cultivate your own life, your own thoughts, your own way of life, your own ability, your own logic and your own understanding, as well as your own reason, in order to evaluate and decide everything, your actions, your success in life, as well as your true peace, tranquility, and righteousness, but also your true love, your well-being towards all living things, and towards effective reality, and create your own effective true knowledge in incontrovertible truth. What belongs especially to true humanity is the good and valuable, but never the negative and evil, all of which is to be controlled, tamed, and conquered. Consider everything always correct, for it is for your own good. Above all, guard yourself against all unworthiness, which is to be conquered and conquered as unworthiness, such as the following bad degenerations: being abstemious, being affected, being aggressive, being ambivalent, being arbitrary, being nailed down, being unsocial, being presumptuous, being malicious, being suspicious, being arrogant, being pushy, being pompous, being bigoted, being choleric, being spiteful, being demagogic, being despotic, being dogmatic, being dominant, being brazen, being selfish, being egomaniacal, being self-centered, jealous, high-handed, simple-minded, mendacious, hypocritical, conceited, one-sided, conceited, elitist, disgusting, arrogant, mean, frustrated, stubborn, impatient, irascible, nasty, slovenly, craving for favors, gracious, merciful, pompous, being arrogant, being insidious, being condescending, being aloof, being boring, being snobbish, being ignorant, being spiteful, being a rabble-rouser, being hysterical, being devious, being cunning, being arrogant, being hopeless, being resigned, being rascally, being infamous, being scheming, being petty, being complicated, being boring, being lethargic, being malicious, being manipulative, being despondent, being naive, being narcissistic, being neurotic, being superficial, being ostentatious, being pedantic, being phlegmatic, being reserved, rejecting advice, being inconsiderate, being self-satisfied, being self-righteous, being self-addicted, being in love with oneself, being unscrupulous, being inflexible, being devious, and so on. So this is what I thought should be written down, what actually results from the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, and is very important for human beings. However, it should not simply be perceived and taken note of, read and believed, but consciously, clearly and effectively thought about and reflected upon, so that reality and its truth can be recognized, understood, and everything that is right can also be implemented and comprehended according to reality. This, however, requires clear and conscious self-thinking, which is absolutely free from any form of influence, and consequently must also not simply be taken at face value what I teach. If, however, what I teach were simply accepted as reality and its truth and thought, decided and acted upon, then the whole thing would only amount to a belief. But this is not to be, consequently only a conscious and clear self-thinking and the effect of reality and its truth brings what is to be indisputable, namely the recognition and knowledge, which are related to the absolute reality. The following is what we had as a private conversation after our last contact. I have put it into writing and compiled it for the last December special time sign, which I now want to read to you. What the truth is. Billy, according to Ta's explanations. Very few human beings in Switzerland who die suddenly at home or in hospital after a COVID vaccination are autopsied, because the cause of sudden death is rarely considered. In autopsied human beings in Europe, renowned pathologists suspect that the COVID vaccination caused the death. In deceased people, pathologists found inflammation of the heart muscle during microscopic examinations, and these changes in the heart looked very similar in the corpses. In several deceased, the pathologists consider mRNA vaccination to be the probable cause of the heart muscle inflammation and the death that resulted. Vaccination was deemed to be the cause of death in these cases, because heart muscle inflammation sometimes causes unexpected, fatal disturbances in the heart rhythm. After vaccination, those vaccinated usually die within a week, so vaccine damage is very likely. In many cases, persons die on the day of their first COVID vaccination or one day after. The time between vaccination and unexpected death may be as long as 20 days, although severe side effects caused by mRNA vaccination may well occur, but usually only after the 20th day. Ta explained that it was not only very likely, but absolutely certain that such inflammatory foci could form in the heart muscle so quickly after an initial vaccination. Earthly medicine is still very far behind in this respect to be able to recognize this. In addition to the inflammations in the heart muscle, there are also often inflammation foci at the vaccination site, whereby these inflammations are amazingly similar to those in the heart muscle. Young and middle-aged human beings in particular very rarely develop inflammation of the heart muscle, but the opposite can happen with the first vaccination. Severe vaccine side effects and deaths are also possible when several other viruses and other pathogens are fought with vaccinations, which can also typically cause heart muscle inflammation, even with herpes viruses. So there are other and also rarer types of pathogens, as well as drug side effects that can be dangerous to health or fatal. Inflammation of the vascular walls also contributes significantly to the course of an acute brain inflammation, because in the brain, destruction of the brain cells occurs in various places, and this is because it is exactly there that accumulations of spike protein occur, which originate from the vaccination on the upper arm. Also in the case of a mild inflammation of the heart muscle, the spike protein also forms in the inflamed areas of the heart, precisely where the blood vessels are inflamed. This means that the spike protein contributes to the damage. However, it would be very important for Earthlings to know this, and this is because those human beings who want to be vaccinated can only make a decision based on information that corresponds only to assumptions and is not based on real knowledge. Human beings do not know how their immune system reacts to vaccinations, whether dangerously, defensively, or benignly and effectively. Human beings do not know whether vaccination will be a good or bad thing in relation to their age, sex, and state of health. The human beings do not know and experience whether severe vaccination side effects or even death may occur in them. Heart muscle damage is well over 1,000 times more likely to occur after mRNA vaccination, as evidenced by the fact that troponin levels increase in the blood after vaccination. Troponin is a protein in the heart muscle that usually indicates damage, whereby women are much more frequently affected by an increase in troponin than men, so the gender difference also plays a certain role. Normally, elevated troponin levels fall back into the normal range within 24 hours, but this is not always the case. The heart muscle damage, even if it is mild and temporary, still has to take into account the effect of the risk-benefit ratio, especially for younger human beings, but this is not easy to judge on the basis of the respective data. The heart muscle cannot regenerate, or at best only minimally, but this is different from case to case. Therefore, it is possible that any vaccination, of whatever kind, may result in mild or severe damage. In any case, it is advisable not to exercise until days after the vaccination, so as not to put additional strain on the heart muscle. What do you say? Ta. There is nothing to be heard about this that is not contrary to the facts of reality. But on my part one will add that you should not be seduced to the foolishness of ending the wearing of respiratory masks, as will be unreasonably proclaimed in Germany in a few hours' time, just as all protective measures are to be suspended. It is still too early for this measure, because still, Billy, the epidemic is not so well controlled that all caution can be dispensed with. I think that is what you are saying. So there is nothing wrong with what I have written? Ta. No, but you are correct in what I meant to say. Billy. Then I have a request, namely if you could talk straight about Pope Pius XII, if you could explain what role he actually played in the last World War. You said that this Pope was a fanatical right-wing extremist and Nazi beyond compare, but that you still had to clarify a few things. Ta. What you say is correct, but in connection with the papacy it is to be mentioned that the previous Pope Ratzinger, who preceded the present Pope and called himself Benedict XVI, will leave the world shortly, on December 31, 2022. It is to be said, however, that from 1939 to 1958 the Vatican was led by Pope Pius XII, who was a fanatical right-wing extremist, an effective Nazi and Jew hater, who was also in complete agreement with the murderous machinations of Adolf Hitler. The Pope was Italian and his real name was Eugenio Maria Giuseppe Giovanni Pacelli. He was a dithyrambic, not exuberant, enthusiastic, but secret, supporter of the extermination of the Jews during the Nazi World War. So Pius XII not only collaborated with the Nazis, but as a fanatical Jew hater he was also secretly planning to collaborate in the extermination of the Jews. He also secretly planned the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis, which he had been striving for with the Nazis even before he took office as Pope, but he restrained himself from publicly speaking out in favor of it. Consequently he also never publicly criticized the Nazi regime. Contrary to his hatred of Jews, he protected Jews from persecution in Rome for appearance's sake, but only because he was recognized and suspected by various people as a Jew hater. What role he really played he knew how to cover up with fictitious and diffuse letters, consequently the real truth will probably never come to light and he may one day be unjustly rehabilitated. The Roman Catholic Church, however, will do everything lying and deceitful to make the farce come true one day that Pope Pius XII will be beatified, although he secretly did everything to make the Holocaust a reality. But the evil, the bad and the degenerate applies in its entirety in this and that form to almost all popes, especially with regard to the abuse of women, which was also true of Pope Pius XII, who ever resided in Rome, for only a very few exceptions could be mentioned, among others a woman who won admission to high office in the Vatican. Billy. Popes, too, are only human beings, after all, with other lechers in high office and lower ranks in the Vatican, as well as the Salvationists in service, probably being the order of the day. It would be a miracle if it were not so, for sexual abstinence or only manual labor is certainly not the order of the day even among the Holy Guard of the Catholic Church. I guess any further words are superfluous. Billy. I suppose it is, but what has been said should just be said. I guess that is correct. Billy. Exactly. But it is now time for us to move on to the things we have to discuss with each other privately, because I have a few things I want to talk to you about. Billy. As you wish. Well, then. Then I want to start by